Hey everyone, welcome back to our chapter book read-along of Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. We are reading this really awesome illustrated copy, illustrated by John Rocco, and we are now on chapter 6. So, we have had a few things happening so far. I want you to pause the video, talk about what you remember, maybe a couple of the characters, what this is even based on, and anything that you have enjoyed so far in the book. Ready? Now, here comes my review. First things first, these characters are based on Greek mythology. Greek mythology is a classic story made up way back in ancient Greece. They used these stories to explain science and weather and things like that. They had their gods that controlled different aspects of the universe. Now, here in Percy Jackson's world, they're real. They're not just myths like in our world. Percy Jackson is a 12-year-old boy, and he finds out that he's pretty special. So, he goes to Yancey Academy and to a field trip with his friend Grover, his teacher, Mr. Brunner, and his teacher, Mrs. Dodds. Now, he gets in trouble, as he usually does, and Mrs. Dodds takes him back into the museum. But she starts to change. She turns into a hideous monster. Huge wings, terrifying claws, glowing eyes. But Mr. Brunner tosses him a pen that turns into a sword, and he slices through her, and she becomes dust. The weird thing afterwards, though, everyone completely forgot that Mrs. Dodds even existed. Percy was the only one who remembered her, or so he thought. His friend Grover did kind of get anxious every time that Percy mentioned Mrs. Dodds. We learn one other thing before Percy goes home for the summer, that Grover and Mr. Brunner are worried about Percy. Grover is talking to Mr. Brunner, and Percy overhears them, saying something about the summer solstice deadline. I have a feeling that's going to come into play soon. Well, Grover and Percy ride a bus home. They see three old ladies knitting the most giant socks they have ever seen, and they snip the cord while staring straight at Percy. Well, Grover freaks out, and so Percy ditched him. Well, he went home to his mom. Her name is Sally Jackson, and she is a very kind, very lovely woman. She is married to a not very kind, very mean, ugly man, inside and out, named Smelly Gabe. Well, Gabe Ugliano, but Percy calls him Smelly Gabe. So, Smelly Gabe is just mean to Sally and Percy. Smelly Gabe is just mean to Sally and Percy. Not fun. Well, Percy and his mother go to their favorite place in the world, a cabin on the beach. And while they're there, a huge storm breaks out. During this huge storm, Grover comes to the door and says there is something terrifying after them. Well, they hop in the car and they drive as fast as they can to what Grover calls Camp Half-Blood. Other funny thing that happened, Grover was no longer wearing pants. And instead of legs, he had furry goat legs and hooves. Grover is what they call a satyr. He's half goat, half man. These are another mythological creature. Well, as they are driving, they are so close to camp, and they get struck by lightning. The car feels like it was exploding. Percy, Grover, and his mom try to make it up the hill to Camp Half-Blood, but are stopped by a terrifying monster. This monster is half bull, half man, and he is angry. He is called the Minotaur. Let me find you a picture of him. Well, He's called the Minotaur, and he attacks them. During the attack, he grabbed Percy's mom and squeezed, and she disappeared in a cloud of gold light. We'll see what happens there. Well, Percy defeats him by breaking off his horn and getting him with it, and he and Grover make it back to the big house on Camp Half-Blood. Now, Grover is right there when Percy wakes up, and he sees an interesting scene. The camp is gorgeous. There's our picture. It is beautiful, right on the beach in Long Island, and it has many different things. Lots of different satyrs and kids. Here's a closer picture for you guys. Different columns that look like Greek architecture, cabins, and lots of different things. Percy meets the camp director named Mr. D and finds out that he is a Greek god himself, Dionysus, who is the god of wine. He also sees his teacher, Mr. Brunner, but Mr. Brunner's real name is Carrion, and he is a centaur, which means he has the top half of a human and back half of a horse. Well, we also meet another camper named Annabeth, who was helping Percy get better by giving him some specific god medicine called ambrosia and nectar. Now, we are on Chapter 6, and we're going to learn all about Camp Half-Blood. Let's see what happens next. Enjoy! Chapter 6. I become Supreme Lord of the Bathroom. Once I got over the fact that my Latin teacher was a horse, we had a nice tour, although I was careful not to walk behind him. I'd done Pooper Scooper Patrol in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade a few times, and I'm sorry, I did not trust Kyrion's back end the way I trusted his front. I passed the volleyball pit. Several of the campers nudged each other. One pointed to the Minotaur horn I was carrying. Another said, "That's him." Most of the campers were older than me. Their satyr friends were bigger than Grover, all of them trotting around in orange Camp Half-Blood t-shirts with nothing else to cover their bare, shaggy hindquarters. I wasn't normally shy, but the way they stared at me made me uncomfortable. I felt like they were expecting me to do a flip or something. I looked back at the farmhouse. It was a lot bigger than I realized. 4 stories tall, sky blue with white trim, an upscale seaside resort. I was checking out the Brass Eagle weather vane on the top when something caught my eye. A shadow in the uppermost window of the attic gape. Something had moved the curtain. Just for a second, I got the distinct impression I was being watched. "What's up there?" I asked Kyrian. He looked where I was pointing, and his smile faded. "Just the attic." "Somebody lives there?" "No," he said with finality. "Not a single living thing." I got the feeling he was being truthful, but I was also sure something had moved that curtain. "Come along, Percy," Kyrian said, his light-hearted tone now a little forced. "Lots to see." We walked through the strawberry fields, where campers were picking bushels of berries while a satyr played a tune on a reed pipe. Kyrian told me that the camp grew a nice crop for export to New York restaurants and Mount Olympus. "It pays our expenses," he explained, "and the strawberries take almost no effort." He said Mr. D had this effect on fruit-bearing plants. They just went crazy when he was around. It worked best with wine grapes, but Mr. D was restricted from growing those, so they grew strawberries instead. I watched the satyr playing his pipe. His music was causing lines of bugs to leave the strawberry patch in every direction, like refugees fleeing a fire. I wondered if Grover could work that kind of magic with music. I wondered if he was still inside the farmhouse, getting chewed out by Mr. D. "Grover won't get in too much trouble, will he?" I asked Kyrian. "I mean, he was a good protector, really." Kyrian sighed. He shed his tweed jacket and draped it over his horse's back like a saddle. "Grover has big dreams, Percy, perhaps bigger than are reasonable. To reach this goal, he must first demonstrate great courage by succeeding as a keeper.
finding a new camper and bringing him safely to Half-Blood Hill.
But he did that.
I might agree with you,
Kyrian said.
but it's not my place to judge. Dionysus and the Council of Cloven Elders must decide. I'm afraid they might not see this assignment as a success. After all, Grover lost you in New York. Then there's the unfortunate fate of your mother, and the fact that Grover was unconscious when you dragged him over the property line. The council might question whether it shows is courage on Grover's part.
I wanted to protest. None of what happened was Grover's fault. I also felt really, really guilty. If I hadn't given Grover the slip at the bus station, he might not have gotten in trouble. He'll get a second chance, won't he? Kyrian winced.
I'm afraid that was Grover's second chance, Percy. The council was not anxious to give him another, either, after what happened the first time, 5 years ago. Olympus knows I've advised him to wait longer before trying again. He's still so small for his age.
How old is he?
Oh, 28.
What? And he's in the 6th grade?
Satyrs mature half as fast as humans, Percy. Grover has been the equivalent of a middle school student for the past 6 years.
That's horrible.
Quite,
Kyrian agreed.
At any rate, Grover is a late bloomer, even by satyr standards, and not yet very accomplished at woodland magic. Alas, he was anxious to pursue his dream. Perhaps now he will find some other career.
That's not fair, I said. What happened the first time? Was it really so bad? Kyrian looked away quickly.
Let's move along, shall we?
But I wasn't quite ready to let the subject drop. Something occurred to me when Kyrian talked about my mother's fate, as if he were intentionally avoiding the word death. The beginning of an idea, a tiny, hopeful fire, started forming in my mind. Kyrian, I said, if the gods and Olympus and all that are real...
Yes, child?
Does that mean the underworld is real too? Kyrian's expression darkened.
Yes, child.
He paused, as if choosing his words carefully.
There is a place where spirits go after death, but for now, until we know more, I would urge you to put that thought out of your mind.
What do you mean until we know more?
Come, Percy, let's see the woods.
As we got closer, I realized how huge the forest was. It took up at least a quarter of the valley, with trees so tall and thick you could imagine nobody had been in there since the Native Americans. Kyrian said,
The woods are stocked, if you care to try your luck, but go armed.
Stocked with what? I asked. Armed with what?
You'll see. Capture the flag is Friday night. Do you have your own sword and shield?
My own...
No, Kyrian said. I don't suppose you do. I think a size 5 will do. I'll visit the armory later.
I wanted to ask what kind of summer camp had an armory, but there was too much else to think about. So the tour continued. We saw the archery range, the canoeing lake, the stables, which Kyrian didn't seem to like very much, the javelin range, the sing-along amphitheater, and the arena, where Kyrian said they held sword and spear fights. Sword and spear fights? I asked.
Cabin challenges and all that, he explained. Not lethal, usually. Oh yes, and there's the mess hall.
Kyrian pointed to an outdoor pavilion, framed in white Grecian columns on a hill overlooking the sea. There were a dozen stone picnic tables. No roof, no walls. What do you do when it rains? I asked. Kyrian looked at me as if I'd gone a little weird.
We still have to eat, don't we?
I decided to drop the subject. Finally, he showed me the cabins. There were 12 of them, nestled in the woods by the lake. They were arranged in a U, with 2 at the base and 5 in a row on either side. They were, without doubt, the most bizarre collection of buildings I had ever seen, except for the fact that each had a large brass number above the door, odds on the left side, evens on the right. They looked absolutely nothing alike. Number 9 had smokestacks, like a tiny factory. Number 4 had tomato vines on the walls and a roof made out of real grass. 7 seemed to be made of solid gold, which gleamed so much in the sunlight it was almost impossible to look at. They all faced a commons area about the size of a soccer field, dotted with Greek statues, fountains, waterbeds, and a couple of basketball hoops, which were more my speed. In the center of the field was a huge stone-lined fire pit. Even though it was warm afternoon, the hearth smoldered. A girl about 9 years old was tending the flames, poking the coals with a stick. The pair of cabins at the head of the field, numbers 1 and 2, looked like his and hers mausoleums, big white marble boxes with heavy columns in front. Cabin 1 was the biggest and bulkiest of the 12. Its polished bronze doors shimmered like a hologram, so that from different angles, lightning shone. Lightning bolts seemed to streak across them. Cabin 2 was more graceful somehow, with slimmer columns garlanded with pomegranates and flowers. The walls were carved with images of peacocks. Zeus and Hera? I guessed.
Correct,
Kyrian said. Their cabins look empty.
Several of the cabins are. That's true. No one ever stays in 1 or 2.
Okay, so each cabin had a different god, like a mascot. 12 cabins for 12 Olympians. But why would some be empty? I stopped in the front of the first cabin on the left, cabin 3. It wasn't high and mighty like cabin 1, but long and low and solid. The outer walls were rough gray stone, studded with pieces of seashell and coral, as if the slabs had been hewn straight from the bottom of the ocean floor. I peeked inside the open doorway, and Kyrian said,
"Oh, I wouldn't do that."
Before he could pull me back, I caught the salty scent of the interior, the wind on the shore at Montauk. The interior walls glowed like abalone. There were 6 empty bunk beds with silk sheets turned down, but there was no sign anyone had ever slept there. The place felt so sad and lonely. I was glad when Kyrian put his hand on my shoulder and said,
"Come along, Percy."
Most of the other cabins were crowded with campers. Number 5 was bright red, a real nasty paint job, as if the color had been splashed on with buckets and fists. The roof was lined with barbed wire. A stuffed wild boar head hung over the doorway, and its eyes seemed to follow me. Inside, I could see a bunch of mean-looking kids, both girls and boys, arm wrestling and arguing with each other, while rock music glared. The loudest was a girl, maybe 13 or 14. She wore a size XXXL Camp Half-Blood shirt under a camouflage jacket. She zeroed in on me and gave me an evil sneer. She reminded me of Nancy Bobofit, though the camper girl was much bigger and tougher looking, and her hair was long and stringy, and brown instead of red. I kept walking, trying to stay clear of Kyrian's hooves. "We haven't seen any other centaurs," I observed.
"No,"
said Kyrian sadly.
"My kinsmen are wild and barbaric folk, I'm afraid. You might encounter them in the wilderness, or at major sporting events, but you won't see any of them here."
"You said your name was Kyrian. Are you really—" He smiled down at me.
"The Kyrian from the stories? Trainer of Hercules and all that? Yes, Percy, I am."
"But shouldn't you be dead?" Kyrian paused, as if the question intrigued him.
"I honestly don't know about should be. The truth is, I can't be dead. You see, eons ago, the gods granted me my wish. I could continue the work I loved. I could be a teacher of heroes as long as humanity needed me. I gained much from that wish, and I gave up much. But I'm still here, so I can only assume I'm still needed."
I thought about being a teacher for 3,000 years. It wouldn't have made my top 10 things to wish for list. "Doesn't it ever get boring?"
No, he said. "Horribly depressing at times, but never boring."
"Why depressing?" Kyrian seemed to turn hard of hearing again.
"Oh, look," he said. "Annabeth is waiting for us."
The blonde girl I'd met at the big house was reading a book in front of the last cabin on the left, number 11. When we reached her, she looked over critically, like she was still thinking about how much I drooled. I tried to see what she was reading, but I couldn't make out the title. I thought my dyslexia was acting up. Then I realized the title wasn't even in English. The letters looked Greek to me. I mean, literally Greek. There were pictures of temples and statues and different kinds of columns, like those in an architecture book.
Annabeth,
Kirian said,
I have master's archery class at noon. Would you take Percy from here?
Yes, sir.
Cabin 11,
Kirian told me, gesturing toward the doorway.
Make yourself at home.
Out of all the cabins, 11 looked most like a regular summer camp cabin, with the emphasis on old. The threshold was worn down, the brown paint peeling. Over the doorway was one of those doctor's symbols, a winged pole with 2 snakes wrapped around it. What did they call it? A catechus. Inside, it was packed with people, both boys and girls, way more than the number of bunk beds. Sleeping bags were spread out all over the floor. It looked like a gym where the Red Cross had set up an evacuation center. Kirian didn't go in. The door was too low for him. But when the campers saw him, they all stood and bowed respectfully.
Well then,
Kirian said.
Good luck, Percy. I'll see you at dinner.
He galloped away toward the archery range. I stood in the doorway, looking at the kids. They weren't bowing anymore. They were staring at me, sizing me up. I knew the routine. I'd gone through it at enough schools. Well, Annabeth prompted, go on. So naturally, I tripped coming in the door and made a total fool of myself. There were some snickers from the campers, but most of them said nothing. Annabeth announced, Percy Jackson, meet Cabin 11. Regular or undetermined? Somebody asked. I didn't know what to say, but Annabeth said, Undetermined. Everybody groaned. A guy who was a little older than the rest came forward. Now, campers. That's what we are here for. Welcome, Percy. You can have a spot on the floor, right over there. The guy was about 19, and he looked pretty cool. He was tall and muscular, with short-cropped sandy hair and a friendly smile. He wore an orange tank top, cut-offs, sandals, and a leather necklace with 5 different colored clay beads. The only thing unsettling about his appearance was a thick white scar that ran from just beneath his right eye to his jaw, like an old knife slash. This is Luke, Annabeth said, and her voice sounded different somehow. I glanced over and could have sworn she was blushing, but she saw me looking, and her expression hardened again. He's your counselor for now. For now? I asked.
You're undetermined, Luke explained patiently. They don't know what cabin to put you in, so you're here. Cabin 11 takes all newcomers. All visitors, naturally he would. Hermes, our patron, is the god of travelers.
I looked at the tiny section of floor they'd given me. I'd had nothing to put there to mark it my own. No luggage, no clothes, no sleeping bag. Just the Minotaur's horn. I thought about setting it down, but then I remembered that Hermes was also the god of thieves. I looked around at the campers' faces, some sullen and suspicious, some grinning stupidly, some eyeing me as if they were waiting for a chance to pick my pockets. How long will I be here? I asked. Good question, Luke said. Until you're determined. How long will that take? The campers all laughed. Come on, Annabeth told me. I'll show you the volleyball court. I've already seen it. Come on. She grabbed my wrist and dragged me outside. I could hear the kids in cabin 11 laughing behind me. When we were a few feet away, Annabeth said, Jackson, you're going to have to do better than that. What? She rolled her eyes and mumbled under her breath. I can't believe I thought you were the one. What's your problem? I was getting angry now. All I know is that I killed some bull guy. Don't talk like that, Annabeth told me. You know how many kids at this camp wish they'd had your chance? To get killed? To fight the Minotaur? What do you think we trained for? I shook my head. Look, if the thing I fought really was the Minotaur, the same one in the stories, yes, Then there's only one. Yes. And he died like a jagillion years ago, right? Theseus killed him in the labyrinth, so monsters don't die, Percy. They can be killed, but they don't die.
Oh, thanks. That clears it up.
They don't have souls like you and me. You can dispel them for a while, maybe even for a whole lifetime if you're lucky, but they're primal forces. Kirian calls them archetypes. Eventually, they reform.
I thought about Mrs. Dodds. You mean if I killed one accidentally with a sword?
Your math teacher? That's right, she's still out there. You just made her very, very mad.
How do you know about Mrs. Dodds?
You talk in your sleep.
You almost called her something. A fury? They're Hades' torturers, right? Annabeth glanced nervously at the ground, as if she expected it to open up and swallow her.
You shouldn't call them by name, even here. We call them the kindly ones, if we have to speak about them at all.
Look, is there anything we can say without it thundering? I sounded whiny, even to myself, but right then I didn't care. Why do I have to stay in cabin 11 anyway? Why is everybody so crowded together? There are plenty of empty bunks right over there. I pointed to the first few cabins, and Annabeth turned pale.
You don't just choose a cabin, Percy. It depends on who your parents are, or your parent.
She stared at me, waiting for me to get it. My mom is Sally Jackson, I said. She works at the candy store in Grand Central Station. At least she used to.
I'm sorry about your mom, Percy, but that's not what I mean. I'm talking about your other parent, your dad.
He's dead. I never knew him. Annabeth sighed. Clearly, she'd had this conversation before with other kids.
Your dad's not dead, Percy.
How can you say that? You know him?
No, of course not.
Then how can you say,
because I know you. You wouldn't be here if you weren't one of us.
You don't know anything about me.
No.
She raised her eyebrow.
I bet you moved around from school to school. I bet you were kicked out of a lot of them.
How?
Diagnosed with dyslexia? Probably ADHD, too.
I tried to swallow my embarrassment. What does that have to do with anything?
Taken together, it's almost a sure sign. The letters float off the page when you read them, right? That's because your mind is hardwired for ancient Greek. And the ADHD? You're impulsive. You can't sit still in a classroom. That's your battlefield reflexes. In a real fight, they'd keep you alive. As for the attention problems, that's because you see too much, Percy, not too little. Your senses are better than a regular mortal's. Of course the teachers want you medicated. Most of them are monsters. They don't want you seeing them for what they really are.
You sound like you went through the same thing?
Most of the kids here did. If you weren't like us, you couldn't have survived the Minotaur, much less ambrosia and nectar.
Ambrosia and nectar?
The food and drink we were giving you to make you feel better. That stuff would have killed a normal kid. It would have turned your blood to fire and your bones to sand, and you'd be dead. Face it, you're a half-blood.
A half-blood?
I was reeling with so many questions, I didn't know where to start. Then a husky voice yelled,
"Well, newbie!" I looked over. The big girl from the ugly red cabin was sauntering toward us. She had 3 other girls behind her, all big and ugly and mean-looking like her, all wearing camo jackets.
"Clarice," Annabeth sighed, "why don't you go polish your spear or something?"
"Sure, Miss Princess," the big girl said, "so I can run you through with it on Friday night."
"Erikoros,"
Annabeth said, which I somehow understood was Greek for go to the crows, though I had a feeling it was worse curse than it sounded.
"You don't stand a chance."
"We'll pulverize you," Clarice said, but her eye twitched. Perhaps she wasn't sure she could follow through with that threat. She turned toward me. "Who's this little runt?"
"Percy Jackson," Annabeth said. "Meet Clarice, daughter of Ares."
I blinked. Like the war god? Clarice sneered. "You got a problem with that?" "No," I said, recovering my wits. "It explains the bad smell." Clarice growled. "We got an initiation ceremony for newbies, Percy." "Whatever. Come on. I'll show you."
Clarice, Annabeth tried to say.
Stay out of it, wise girl.
Annabeth looked pained, but she did stay out of it, and I didn't really want her help. I was the new kid. I had to earn my own rep. I handed Annabeth my Minotaur horn and got ready to fight. But before I knew it, Clarice had me by the neck and was dragging me toward a cinder block building that I knew immediately was the bathroom. I was kicking and punching. I'd had been in plenty of fights before, but this big girl Clarice had hands like iron. She dragged me into the girls' bathroom. There was a line of toilets on one side and a line of showers on the other. It smelled like any public bathroom, and I was thinking, as much as I could think with Clarice ripping my hair out, that if this place belonged to the gods, they should have been able to afford classier johns. Clarice's friends were all laughing, and I was trying to find the strength I'd used before to fight the Minotaur, but it wasn't there.
Like he's big 3 material, Clarice said as she pushed me toward one of the toilets. Yeah, right. Minotaur probably fell over laughing. He was so stupid looking.
Her friends snickered. Annabeth stood in the corner, watching through her fingers. Clarice bent me over on my knees and started pushing my head toward the toilet bowl. It reeked like rusted pipes and, well, what goes into toilets? I strained to keep my head up. I was looking at the scummy water, thinking, I will not go into that. I won't. Then something happened. I felt a tug in the pit of my stomach. I heard the plumbing rumble, the pipes shudder. Clarice's grip on my hair loosened. Water shot out of the toilet, making an arc straight over my head, and the next thing I knew, I was sprawled on the bathroom tiles with Clarice screaming behind me. I turned just as water blasted out of the toilet again, hitting Clarice straight in the face so hard it pushed her down to her butt. The water sprayed on her like the spray from a fire hose, pushing her backward into the shower stall. She struggled, gasping, and her friends started coming toward her, but then the other toilets exploded too, and 6 more streams of toilet water blasted them back. The showers acted up too, and together all the fixtures sprayed the camouflage girls right out of the bathroom, spinning them around like pieces of garbage being washed away. As soon as they were out the door, I felt the tug in my gut lessen. The water shot off as quickly as it had started. The entire bathroom was flooded. Annabeth hadn't even been spared. She was dripping wet, but she hadn't been pushed out the door. She was standing in exactly the same place, staring at me in shock. I looked down and realized I was sitting in the only dry spot in the whole room. There was a circle of dry floor around me. I didn't have 1 drop of water on my clothes. Nothing. I stood up, my legs shaky. Annabeth said, "How did you?" "I don't know," I said. We walked to the door. Outside, Clarice and her friends were sprawled in the mud, and a bunch of other campers had gathered around to gawk. Clarice's hair was flattened across her face. Her camouflage jacket was sopping and smelled like sewage. She gave me a look of absolute hatred. "You're dead, new boy. You're totally dead." I probably should have let it go, but I said, "You want to gargle some toilet water again, Clarice? Close your mouth." Her friends had to hold her back. They dragged her toward Cabin 5, while the other campers made way to avoid her flailing feet. Annabeth stared at me. I couldn't tell whether she was just grossed out or angry at me for dousing her. "What?" I demanded. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said, "that I want you on my team for Capture the Flag." Well, Percy indeed becomes Supreme Lord of the Toilets. That was Chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed it. We learned so much in this chapter. We learned that Percy is a half-blood, which means his parent is a Greek god and his mother is human. So, we also learned about the camp just a little bit more. Took a tour. I have a map here of Camp Half-Blood, as you can see. Kind of look at that. We got the big house. We got the forest over here. Oh, these are strawberry fields. We have the climbing wall. We have the cabins. the canoe lake. There's the beach. Lots of different things. They have an armory. What camp has an armory? And then we learn about the cabins. So each cabin represents the main 12 gods. Zeus, Hera, gotta look at this, Demeter, Athena, Artemis, Aphrodite, Dionysus, Poseidon, Ares, Apollo, Hephaestus, and Hermes. Well, we learn that Percy is, as they call, undecided or undeclared. His godly parent hasn't told him who he is yet. So he goes in Hermes' cabin, which is the god of travelers. So anyone who hasn't been claimed just hangs out there. That's the most full cabin, isn't it? We also meet Luke, and he is the counselor of that cabin. Let's discuss a few things that happened in the chapter. What does Percy notice about the farmhouse as he walks away from it? He notices it's huge. 4 stories for a farmhouse. And what does he see up in the top? He thinks he sees someone in the attic. But Riordan says nobody alive is up there. That's ominous. Why does Percy feel guilty about getting Grover into trouble? Why does he feel guilty? Well, if Percy hadn't ditched him, Grover might not be getting into trouble, because he might have brought him right to camp, and they wouldn't have been chased by the Minotaur. Oops. Why do you think Percy asked Riordan about the underworld? Percy thinks that he has the beginning of an idea. A tiny, hopeful fire started forming in his head. What do you think he's thinking about when he thinks about the underworld? So the underworld is where, in Greek mythology, souls would go when they died. If you've seen the Disney Hercules, you know, it's good stuff. So, I bet Percy is thinking about his mom and maybe figuring out a way that he can go back and save her. But what does Riordan tell him to do? Put that thought out of your mind, kid. It's not going to happen. Why is Annabeth upset with Percy after they leave cabin 11? Well, Percy asks something, doesn't he? He says, how long is it going to take me to get decided? Why has nobody claimed me yet? Well, there's some kids who have been in Hermes' cabin this whole time and haven't been, like, even called out or anything. They don't know who their godly parent is. So Annabeth says, hey, can you chill just a little bit? Also, Percy really didn't understand this whole thing. He didn't understand that his dad is a Greek god quite yet. He was still trying to figure all this out. Why doesn't Percy want Annabeth's help when he gets into that fight with Clarice? Well, he wants to prove himself, doesn't he? He has to make his way as the new kid at the camp. Sometimes that would happen when there's like a new kid going to a school, right? You kind of have to make your stance. So he didn't want Annabeth fighting his battle. What happens to Clarice and her friends in the girls' bathroom? What happens? Well, Percy almost gets his head stuck in a toilet, doesn't he? But then the water acts a little funny. It shoots out of the toilet like a fire hose and knocks her and her friends across the room. And out the door why does Annabeth's kind of opinion of Percy change? Or why do you think her opinion changes? He suddenly became very interesting. Can he control water? Does it respond to him? Is he the Supreme Lord of the Toilets? He just became very interesting, and she wants him on her team for Capture the Flag on Friday. Well, one more thing I want to show you is this beautiful picture of the cabins from Camp Half-Blood. So we have Zeus and Hera down here. Over here is the Poseidon and all those. The hearth in the middle. Gorgeous. And the kind of rundown one of Hermes down here at the bottom. Such a cool picture. I have that one printed out over here too. Alright, that is all we are going to discuss for Chapter 6. I become the Supreme Lord of the Bathroom. And we will see what happens to Percy and his friends in our next chapter. I hope you have enjoyed, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone!